and welcome to Imagine This Stories. Do you have a pet? Maybe a fish or a cat or a goat? My son Jake used to have a dog named Moose. He was a great dog. He was big and brown and so sweet. But when Moose was thirsty and went to get a drink from his bowl, he made a mess. There was water on the floor and water on his feet and water dripping from his mouth that left a trail as he walked away. In today's story, you're going to hear about some people who lapped water like a dog. Hopefully they won't make such a mess. So sit back, relax, kick off your shoes, and for the next few minutes, imagine this. Today's story is called Lapping Water Like a Dog. It's about Gideon. Remember him? We started his story last week. He was the guy working in a hole because he was so afraid of the Midian army. Then God told him that he was going to save the people of Israel from this army. And Gideon was like, yeah, okay, maybe. But just to be sure, he put some wool out on the ground one night and asked God to keep the ground dry and the wool wet. And then the next night, he did it the other way around. And that's just what God did. If you don't remember this part of the story, you can go and check out last week's story sometime. It's called Hide and Seek. But moving on. God told this man Gideon he was going to defeat this huge army that had been attacking the people of Israel for 7 years. And he told them it was possible because God was going to go with them. So Gideon gathered up an army and headed out for battle. They set up camp. And then the next morning, when they woke up, God said to Gideon, "Your army's too big." I'm sure Gideon was like, what? "Your army," said God. "You have too many soldiers." I don't know what Gideon said, but I can imagine he was thinking, have you seen the other army? They're huge. I wish I had twice as many soldiers as they do. God said, if you win with so many men, you will think that you won because of how great you all are, and not because I'm with you. So here's what you're going to do. Go tell all the men, if any of them are afraid, they can go home. So that's what Gideon did. He called out to all 32,000 men and said, God says if any of you are afraid of this fight, you can go home. What do you imagine happened? Let me tell you, a bunch of them packed up their stuff and hurried home. 22,000 of them, in fact, leaving just 10,000 men with Gideon. I imagine Gideon looked around and was like, well, this isn't what I was hoping would happen. But God wasn't finished. He then said to Gideon, your army's still too big. Again, I imagine Gideon was like, what? God continued. He said, take all the soldiers down to the river and tell them to get a drink. So Gideon did just that. Most of the men, when they arrived at the river, knelt down and put their faces into the water and drank. But 300 of them scooped up water into their hands and lapped it up like dogs. You see those guys lapping up water like dogs, God said? Those are the men who are going to fight in the battle. Tell everyone else to go home. What? 300 men? Yikes! So all the other men went home. That night, I imagine Gideon was tossing and turning, wondering how in the world he was going to fight with only 300 men. But listen, this is really cool. God knew how worried Gideon was, and so he told him, grab your buddy Purah and sneak down into the enemy camp. Gideon and Purah left their camp, which was up on a hill, and moved slowly and quietly toward the Midian army. The Bible tells us when they saw them, there were so many soldiers and camels, you couldn't even count them all. They looked like sand on a seashore. I imagine Gideon was not feeling better. Well, not yet. Quietly, they moved toward the guards who were on the edge of the camp and listened to them talking. One of them said, I had a dream. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into our camp. It struck the tent so hard that the tent flipped over and collapsed. His friend responded, oh no, this means that God's going to help Gideon, the son of Joash, the Israelite, win the battle tomorrow. Ah! How do you imagine Gideon felt when he heard this? If you said, I imagine he felt great, you're right. The Bible says when Gideon heard this dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshiped God right there. He then returned to the camp of Israel and called out, "Get up! The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." It was still the middle of the night. Gideon divided the 300 men into 3 groups. He told them to each grab a trumpet, because you always carry a trumpet when you go into battle. He also said grab an empty jar with a torch inside. Next, he told them, "Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, you do exactly as I do." Gideon and the 100 men who were with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed their guards. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. That had to be loud. The other 200 men blew their trumpets and smashed their jars even louder. Grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpet they were to blow, they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" Well, imagine waking up to that. The Midianite army were surrounded by only 300 men, yet they were freaking out. Then, God caused them to start running around and fighting each other. When the battle was over, the Israelites had won, and the Midianite army was scattered. God had kept his word and helped Gideon and his small army of water-lapping men defeat a mighty army. The end. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Want to hear something cool? God used Gideon to defeat a huge army. I know, you're thinking, yeah, we just heard the story. But listen again. God used Gideon, a frightened man who was hiding in a hole, to do something he thought was impossible. You see, God likes to use ordinary people to do extraordinary things. You may be young, not so young, or downright old. You may feel like you're not important and have nothing to offer. That's not true. Whoever you are, if you team up with God, he can use you to do things you think are impossible. Thanks so much for listening. If you want to read this story for yourself, you can find it in the Bible in the book of Judges, chapter 7. Please tell other people about this podcast and have a great day. I look forward to talking to you again soon as we imagine this.